Thank you. Serendipity is a great thing. You'll see my topic there, New Zealand and its specific interventions, which was clearly chosen some weeks ago. So yesterday, when our chair today gave his keynote speech, I was very pleased to hear him say, intervention is sometimes the right thing to do. And I think I'm quoting you verbatim there, which brings it together quite nicely, because I was talking, of course, about an international invention, and here we're talking, the symposium is about intrastate civil unrest and conflict. But nonetheless, intervention is often the right thing to do. So in this session, I want to look at what New Zealand does for its neighbours, how New Zealand intervenes, the motives for New Zealand's interventions, and what happens in a practical sense. Before I move on to that, I do hope that I'll talk for less than 15 minutes, far better for Q&A, far better for discussion than just listen to me talking. That map is a map of New Zealand's military interventions in the region generally. And notice how few of them are in the Pacific, which is an interesting thing. Although those numbers there do hide a couple of things. So there are small groups in the Solomon Islands, there's still small groups in Tonga. There's naval forces recently have been doing fisheries patrols in the region, that kind of thing. But New Zealand's focus, despite the rhetoric, is not necessarily about the Pacific, and we do need to keep that in mind, I think. So what I'm going to talk about generally, it's not a history lesson, so I'm not going to go into any detail at all. And there are people in this room on any one of the subject areas that I'm going to cover who know the history and the detail far better than I. So I will gloss over lightly. My apologies to the professional scholars of those topics. Look at the three case studies I've chosen, arbitrarily, really, although there are not that many cases in the region, and the next slide, or the one after, we'll look at them. But look also at the terms response and risk reduction. Aficionados of the New Zealand national security system will recognise those as two components of what we call the 4 R's of emergency management. Risk reduction, readiness, response, and recovery from any event. And that works in natural disasters, where the terms generally come from, but it also works right across the security system. In theory, I've chosen to look at what I think are the two most important areas in terms of New Zealand's interventions, those of risk reduction and of response. Strictly speaking, we should look at risk reduction first, but I've chosen to look at response first to actual events, because it's when we see the actual events occurring, or having occurred, that we can then stand back and say, well, maybe if we'd done some prior risk reduction activity, we would not have had to respond. So it's a little bit back to front, but nonetheless, I think it works here. This is rhetoric of official words, and not necessarily of practice. But those first three, although all of those bullet points are taken from official documentations, they're taken from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs 4-year Pacific Plan, they're taken from Ministry of Defence Pacific Partnership Strategy. That document that doesn't reproduce particularly well on the right is the front cover of the Pacific Plan. It's all available online if anyone wants it. You can see as you read those statements that officially at least we consider ourselves to be a part of the Pacific, and we consider ourselves to be linked inextricably with our friends in the Pacific. The enduring principles for engagement are, as the Pacific Partnership document has it, in Maori, and they mean from the top, the recognition of deep and enduring whakapapa connections, navigating together, journey towards a circular economy, all of us together, and focus towards excellence, which are good principles to have, I guess, although we did have some enduring principles from about 4 or 5 years ago, which didn't endure because these ones took their place, but nonetheless, I'm very sceptical of enduring anything, actually, enduring but it's important for the point to be made that New Zealand is committed to the region. So, again, for students of this kind of thing, this is very once over lightly. 3 basic forms of intervention: diplomacy, development, and defence. And all of these occur before, during, and after any form of civil unrest. Ideally, if you intervene as a risk reduction way before, then you won't have to intervene as a response to something going wrong. Ideally. The real world is rarely ideal, of course. For those who do want some theory, there's a scholar, Christopher Blackman, Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace, published, I think, in 2022, published, I think, last year. And he derives principles about fighting and coming away from fighting that work at every level, from street gangs in New York up to the major interstate disagreements, conflicts. Very, very easy to read and very well worth reading. Just to remind ourselves that there have been conflicts in the region over the years for a long time now. The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that I haven't put up every form of conflict, and I'll let the eagle-eyed of you work out which ones I haven't put up. Of course, it was deliberate. Not. Let me see, what else do I say? Yes, it's not about history. What I'm looking to do is to interrogate New Zealand's approach to the 3 conflicts that I've put in bold. What did New Zealand think it was doing? What did it do? Why did it do it? Those kinds of questions. So I'm not going to go into the history of the events, which have been ably done for different events already today. So let's move on straight away to Bougainville. That cheery person in the photograph, of course, is Don McKinnon, who was Deputy Prime Minister before New Zealand got involved in Bougainville, and Foreign Minister, and then dropped the Deputy Prime Minister's role and was Foreign Minister. And those statements are taken either from Hansard, statements in Parliament, or from interviews that I did immediately after the event for a book that I was going to write on New Zealand and Bougainville that I didn't write. But nonetheless, the interviews and the research is always useful. That's the great advantage, isn't it, of having computers and digital storage. You don't actually lose your notes. The point, I think, to take from here is the fact that something had to be done. This was in McKinnon's own minds. And that what had to be done had to be driven by the antagonists within Bougainville. It was not something that could be dictated by outsiders. McKinnon was especially strong, and is still especially strong on this. I spoke to him coincidentally about 3 weeks ago, and he said, I've just found all my notes from Bougainville. I was going to throw them out, and I think I'll go back and I'll write a book about it. He said, good on him. The final person there, John Hayes, we set out to intimidate with integrity, and when he told me that, in 2001, I think I interviewed him, I thought, intimidate with integrity, what a great title for anything. And the integrity, the points about integrity here from the New Zealand point of view were to give the participants agency, to allow them to deal with the issues in their own way. We gave them the space and then said, it's up to you. We were very strong on the fact that this is about process, not outcome. And there we differed from our Australian, 5 minutes, there we differed from our Australian colleagues who wanted a set outcome and work towards it. We just said, we'll give you a process and you guys go for it. The Burnham Declaration, the Lincoln Declaration, the Truce Monitoring Group, the Peace Monitoring Group, these are all the little areas where New Zealand was closely involved. Response. Solomon Islands, response. Again, you get the sense that we're there to help. We also get the sense, the Pacific consensus. New Zealand doesn't act unilaterally in these things ever. We work through the forum, we get the agreement, Pacific Islands Forum, get the agreement of other states before New Zealand intervenes. And the Regional Assistance Mission for Solomon Islands, police-led, with Defence Force support, which is important, and is a point that Phil Goff made many times, a much younger Phil Goff in the photograph. Tonga response to the riots, again, we were there to give support to the Tongan government. Note that's the point there, the government's continued support for democratisation was affirmed, but we're not telling you, Tonga, what to do. That's up to you to work it out for yourself. It's part of being sovereign, even if we disagree with them. And again, small police and NZDF force. Enough on the response. To go back, risk reduction, the kinds of things that we can do to try to avoid having to respond. And this all comes from the Pacific Partnership Plan, which is a 4-year plan. I won't read all of those out, but it indicates that New Zealand wants to be committed primarily with economic aid and development aid and that kind of thing. It's of interest to all the talk we've had of China. From 2008 to 2020, according to the Lowy Institute, an Australian institute, aid in the Pacific, Australia, 40%. New Zealand was about 8.5%. The United States was 7.8%. China was 8.5%. I think the important thing here is that the West dramatically outspends the China in the region. And if you believe in the old adage, follow the money, then that's going to tell you something, I think. And the kinds of bullet points at the bottom are the kinds of things that we hope will lead to the kind of societies that don't feel the need to fight themselves, to fight internally. Risk reduction is not only done by the development assistance people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, it's also done by the New Zealand Defence Force with what's called the Mutual Assistance Programme and a range of other initiatives which are about training the armed forces, working with the armed forces, developing the armed forces by example of how good armed forces work in their relationships with the governments, as well as giving material aid and succour. Of course, the cynic might say, you were doing the mutual assistance program with Fiji before the coups, weren't you? What kind of lessons were you teaching them? Risk reduction doesn't always work. Or maybe if we hadn't been doing it, it would have been worse. Who knows? Finished. We're trying to reduce the likelihood of civil unrest by working with the Pacific states. But if it does occur, and you can never say that the risk reduction will work, if it does occur, we're trying to mitigate the consequences and assist the governments to reduce the causes. And the final point I think is quite important. It's a sort of conclusion that jumps out of nowhere because I haven't talked about this, but we aren't just being altruistic. We're doing this for our own benefit as well as for the benefit of our island neighbours. New Zealand's prime aim, as far as the Pacific is concerned, is to have our soft power recognised and achieve New Zealand's ends. So we are working for our own interests here. Thank you very much.